and gentlemen, welcome back. We now move to one of the most anticipated session of the day, the keynote address. It is a great honor to introduce Dr. Jaideep Prabhu. Dr. Jaideep Prabhu, Professor of Marketing, Jawaharlal Nehru Professor of Indian Business and Enterprise, and Director, Cambridge Center for India and Global Business, Judge Business School, University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. Professor Prabhu is globally renowned for its pioneering work in frugal innovation and inclusive growth ideas that strongly resonate with the theme of this conference. I am truly privileged for us to have him here today. May I kindly request Professor Jaideep Prabhu to deliver the keynote address.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see my slides.
Yes, sir.
Yes? Okay, great. So I would like to talk about my most recent book, which is, I see, okay, hold on. I need to display settings. Perhaps it's not showing properly. It does. Hold on, let me just reshare. Okay, are you able to see my slides properly? Are the slides showing properly?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. It's
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'd like to talk about the work that I have done with co-authors over the last 15 years on this idea of frugal innovation. And I want to specifically talk about a book that I've just published with co-authors called LeanSpark. So my journey into frugal innovation began in 2008 when I took up a chair in Indian business at Cambridge and began to study innovation in emerging markets like India. Prior to that, I had studied innovation in large Western corporations in high-tech sectors like pharmaceuticals. But when I started to look at innovation in countries like India, I was struck by how the approach seemed very different from their Western corporate counterparts. First, the approach was very frugal. The innovators in India were very good at doing more with less. Second, the mindset was very flexible. So if they had a plan, they were very good at switching to another plan, improvising, a lot of lateral thinking. And then third, a lot of their solutions seem designed to bring people who are outside the formal economy into the formal economy. So this approach, frugal, flexible, and inclusive innovation in India was often described by the word jugaad. So my co-authors and I then decided to actually write a book which we called Jugaad Innovation, where we explored what this actually meant in the context of resource-constrained environments like India. And we defined it as the art of overcoming harsh constraints by improvising an effective solution. Not a perfect solution, but a good enough solution that importantly makes the best use of limited resources available in that context. And after we published this book, people from other parts of the world wrote to tell us that they had something similar in their country. So I recently went to Brazil, where there is a very thriving ecosystem of practice and research on frugal innovation. And in Brazil, they told us that they have two words to describe the same phenomenon as jugaad. And we see this not only in emerging markets, but we also see this kind of innovation in some developed economies. In the book, we featured many such frugal innovators, such jugaad innovators that we saw in India and across the developing world. So, for instance, Mansukh Bhai, who you see here, who is a potter from Gujarat, developed shortly after a very serious earthquake that hit Gujarat in the early 2000s, a clay fridge. He got the idea when he opened the local newspaper after the earthquake, and he saw a picture of somebody's matka that was broken, and the caption read, "Poor man's fridge broken." And that actually gave him the idea to create a fridge using the principles of clay and water evaporating through the clay. So you see the fridge that he designed here. He set up a factory in his village. He trained local women to make these fridges, and he went on to sell them, including on the internet. And he embodies these principles of frugal, inclusive, and flexible innovation. But it's not just grassroots innovators and startups that we encountered. Even large firms multinationals had begun to adopt these approaches of frugal innovation and were very successful in India and other emerging markets in the late 2000s. So this product from Nokia was developed actually by Nokia in the late 90s, specifically for people living in urban slums in cities like Sao Paulo, Accra in Ghana, and Mumbai. They had people who went to live in these slums to observe how people were buying and interacting with mobile phones. They saw that people would cover the phones in plastic to protect them from dust, and they would also use the weak light in the phone to see their way in the dark. So the people from Nokia took these insights back, and the company came up with this highly affordable, robust phone that had a dust-proof keypad and a built-in flashlight. This was a tremendously successful product. It sold over 200 million worldwide and was the world's best-selling consumer electronics device until the iPod and iTunes. And once you had millions of people around the developing world, including in rural Africa, for instance, with these devices, you could then do other frugal innovations for them. So M-Pesa was introduced by Vodafone in Kenya in 2007 to enable a lady like this to use her basic Nokia phone, not only to call her son who is living in Nairobi and earning a regular income, not only to ask him how he was doing, but also to ask him to send money home, which he could do by texting it to her like a text message. She would receive the money on her phone. She would go to a local corner shop, Kirana shop that was an M-Pesa agent, and transfer some of that money to the agent and get cash back. So this was frugal financial inclusion. This was mobile payments done very frugally because M-Pesa did not have to create any new assets. It took what was already there. People already had phones, they were already used to texting, and they already had Kirana shops in their village, and basically M-Pesa joined the dots to create this service. This was a hugely successful service in Kenya. Over 25 million people now have access to this, and lots of transactions, often of very small amounts, take place on this platform. And once people were enabled to make these micropayments, you could sell them other products frugally and affordably, like, for instance, solar lighting kits like this. So this company, M-Kopa, can sell such a kit to a lady like this, install it in a hut in rural Kenya, but she might not be able to pay the upfront cost of the kit. Instead, she would pay as you go. She would pay weekly installments using M-Pesa, small amounts, which made it easier for her to get access to this product. But it also made it easier for M-Kopa because they didn't have to send somebody to the village every week to collect the payments. They could do this electronically and digitally. So my co-authors and I, we studied this phenomenon and wrote that book in 2012, all about this kind of innovation in emerging markets. But after the book came out, we realized there was a lot of interest in the same phenomenon in the West for the West. So we started to study that, and we realized that in developed economies, this kind of frugal economy was being underpinned and driven by a particular type of consumer that we call prosumers. These were not passive recipients of products and services from companies. They were much more actively involved in the socio-economic process, and they were driving three movements that underpins a frugal economy. The sharing economy, where people like you and me can now trade spare assets on some digital platform. Think about Airbnb, for instance. The second is the maker movement, where small teams, sometimes of our students in places like Cambridge, can now do things that only large companies or the government could have done 10 or 20 years ago, and not only in hardware, but not only in software, but increasingly also in hardware. And then the third is the circular economy, where we are moving increasingly from the linear system of the 20th century, where companies would take resources from nature, make products and services with them that they sell to us. We would use them as consumers and then dump them back in nature. That process is not only wasteful, it is fundamentally unsustainable. So instead, companies and economies are trying to move to a circular system where all the products and services resources are reduced, reused, and recycled. So, as an example of the sharing economy, I gave the example of Airbnb. What explains the success of a company like Airbnb? Fundamentally, their business model is frugal. So here you see a quote from Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, who said that in 2014, for instance, they were competing with the bricks and mortar hotel chains like Marriott. Marriott may want to add 30,000 rooms in that year. It would take them a whole year to do it. And that is because they would have to physically create that capacity. That would take time, money, people, resources. Airbnb could create that capacity in 2 weeks because they were not having to create anything new. They would take what is already there, just like M-Pesa. People already have spare rooms in their homes. They would just put that information on the Airbnb platform for others to access. So that's the sharing economy. Now, what about the maker movement? This is, as I said, where small teams, sometimes of our students, are doing remarkable things. This is one of my former students here in Cambridge, Eben Upton. He was a mature student. He was doing a part-time MBA with us in the business school while he was responsible for teaching computer science in the computer science department of the university. And he and his colleagues in the computer science department were noticing that fewer and fewer young people were applying to study computer science not only in Cambridge but across the Western world. And many of the ones who had applied had never opened a computer to play with the hardware, and they had never done any coding. So they said, what if we gave them a very basic computer? And you can see one that he's holding in his hand, a microprocessor. They would have to tinker with hardware to make it work, and they would have to code. And it would be so cheap that if they broke it, it wouldn't be a big deal. The first one they developed was about $30. They now have a $5 version. They thought they would sell a few thousand units. They have sold millions. They sell about 7 million every year. And others are tapping into this resource to make all kinds of Internet of Things devices to solve problems in their communities. So this movement is largely driven by entrepreneurs. But what about large companies? Those companies that typically have very big R&D centers and do very expensive high-end innovation. Would they also do frugal innovation? So my co-author and I, we began to study this question, and we interviewed large companies in the West from across sectors, from automotive to pharmaceuticals, healthcare, FMCG, banking, education, etc. And we wrote a follow-up book, which we called Frugal Innovation, which was specifically about how large Western corporations were incorporating frugal innovation alongside doing their old style R&D driven, very expensive innovation. So this book came out in 2015. Subsequent to that, I have continued to engage with the phenomenon of Jugaad innovation in the context of India. And in India, the real question that exercises a lot of minds is how do we get around some of the downsides of Jugaad? Yes, it can come up with very affordable solutions, but sometimes these solutions fail to scale. So how do we scale Jugaad? So I began to co-teach a course on this very topic at Ashoka University with two colleagues from Ashoka, Priyank Narayan and Mukesh Sood. And in the course, over the years, from 2016 onwards, we realized that the whole phenomenon of Jugaad innovation in India was evolving. More and more people had figured out how to avoid some of the downsides of Jugaad while getting the benefits of it and scaling it. And more they were bringing in high technology to do this. So based on that course, we just published in January this year a new book called LeanSpark, Frugal by Design, Global in Impact. And in this book, we theorize about this new approach to scaling Jugaad, which we call LeanSpark. So how is LeanSpark different from Jugaad? First, in terms of the mindset, Jugaad is often improvisational, whereas the LeanSpark approach is about intentional frugality over the long term. It's strategic. In terms of durability, Jugaad is often about short-term temporary fixes, whereas LeanSpark aspires to think about long-term robust solutions. Jugaad is often accused of circumventing laws or norms, whereas LeanSpark aspires to work within legal and ethical bounds. Jugaad can be hyper-local often, so we examine how it can be designed to scale. And finally, Jugaad may ignore externalities, but LeanSpark tries to minimize social and environmental costs. So we focus on four key principles of this LeanSpark approach. One is lean execution. So this is about experimentation and continuous learning in a deliberate fashion from the design phase. Second is purposeful simplicity, deliberately focusing only on essential features and eliminating unnecessary complexity. Third is adaptive scalability, how to design so that you can evolve solutions across diverse environments. And finally, systemic sustainability, addressing root causes so that you minimize waste and create enduring value. So, of course, this is easier said than done. In the book, we try to give ways in which actual companies in India and some from outside India have actually implemented these principles. So lean execution is all about building, measuring, and learning, faster learning, less waste. Purposeful simplicity is about focus on core value and thus reducing cost and making it easier to adopt and maintain. Adaptive scalability is all about using modular design and interoperable architecture so that you can have replication without reinvention. And systemic sustainability is about closed loop thinking to reduce waste. And this is about long-term viability. So we look at many cases from India and elsewhere where this has been done systematically over the last few years, sometimes decades, at scale. One of our chapters is on ISRO and space tech, and we look at how ISRO has applied these principles in the space context and how now there is a whole ecosystem of space tech companies that are applying these principles. Another chapter is devoted to digital public infrastructure and the India stack, and we look at how that was done within government, applying some of these principles of frugal scalability, and how that is also now spawning a whole startup ecosystem of fintech. The most recent development in India, which is exciting with global implications, is of course Frugal AI. We have another chapter looking at how companies like Servam.ai are bringing affordability and accessibility in the AI space in areas like education and health. And another chapter we focus on is clean mobility, looking at how India has innovated in electric vehicles and battery swapping technology in a frugal, affordable, scalable way. So in conclusion, I would like to say that based on my work over the last 15 years, I really believe that the world needs this kind of frugal, flexible, and inclusive innovation. I believe that India can gain by engaging with developed economies and vice versa. And I also believe that large and small organizations can work together to improve lives everywhere. Thank you very much.
I request audience if they have any question.
Good evening, sir. My name is Shashi Bhushan Kumar, and my question is frugal innovation about doing more with less or about rethinking the entire system of value creation?
Thank you very much, Sashi. Great question. So it's both. I think, of course, the core is doing more with less. And that can be done at any level. It can be done by individuals. Of course, individuals in India are always applying Jugaad to their everyday lives and work. It can be done at a team level within a company. It can be done at a company level, whether it's a startup or a large company. But it can also be done systemically, as you point out. And that can be done at a government level. And this is where India has innovated something very impressive globally, very innovative globally in the whole India stack, starting with Aadhaar, then building on it, eKYC, UPI, and now taking that success and applying those same ideas of frugality and scalability, doing more with less systemically. They have created digital public infrastructure, the rails on which the digital economy in India can run. And we are on top of all that applying an AI layer frugally. And the key principles there are very much the principles of LeanSpark. That is lean execution, a lot of experimentation and learning before scaling. Then also purposeful simplicity, focusing on the core that you want, core problem you want to solve and the core features, and also figuring out how to scale this, adaptive scalability. So great question. I hope I was able to answer it.
Thank you, sir.
So my question is, this frugal innovations is very helpful for the startup because they lack a lot of resources, but there's a dilemma in the sense like there is a huge chances of infringement with related frugal innovations because the patents comes with cost. So how could this be addressed?
This is a great question again. And actually, a lot of the frugal innovation mindset and approach actually skirts intellectual property. Often, intellectual property, as you said, adds cost and slows down the process. So, even large companies like GE that have entered the frugal innovation space, they have tried not to go down the IP route. Instead, when they're developing medical devices and so on, they try to use off-the-shelf components that are off patent to develop a product, a solution like an ECG, portable ECG machine, and so on. Now, you're right about appropriation. So, how, if you don't have IP, and in order to reduce cost and speed up your development, if you don't have IP, how do you ensure that others do not appropriate, and how do you keep your market position? Well, the way that we do it in marketing is through branding and design. So you can copyright the design, you build a brand, you build a customer relationship, you build customer loyalty. So that is the way you mark against appropriation. And then ultimately you keep innovating. So that is the other way from marketing, from a marketing perspective, you keep your market position without having to resort to IP to defend your monopoly position.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really very, very thought-provoking and very, very nice lecture with a lot of energy. And just one question, actually, is a relative question, I'm saying the developing country vis-a-vis developed countries. Can we raise the level of our living with frugal innovation at the grassroots level? I'm talking about the rural India, because yes, frugal innovation is there for centuries, actually. But is that really can help us in raising the level? Because in the Western world, it doesn't happen like this, and they have a better life, actually.
This is such a great question, and this is really the question that has driven my research as well, is to ask that question with the hope that this is a way to drive grassroots-led sustainable growth. Now, you mentioned that the West doesn't need it or doesn't do it. The fact is that the West grew from such grassroots innovation. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution and you look at the hockey stick growth that happened in the West in the early, in the both the 18th and the 19th century, a lot of it happened because ordinary people, not people from the elites, not the aristocracy or people who had the landed gentry, but ordinary, often educated or semi-educated people had access to the tools to enable them to innovate and capture the returns from that innovation. And that is how these economies bootstrapped growth and grew. And my hope is that, and my belief is that, that is what countries like India as well need. There is only so much development that can happen top down. Yes, the state can do things and should do things. It can create the conditions for innovation to happen. Yes, large companies can do things and do things. But in the end, if you want, especially in a very large country like India, where a large percentage of the population is rural, is in agriculture, is in a very unproductive part of the economy, the way to grow is to enable them to increase their productivity. Now, how do you do that? You give them productivity enhancing tools. But that has to be done affordably through the market system. So you give them mobile telephony. On the back of mobile telephony, you give them mobile payments. On the back of mobile payments, you give them other productivity enhancing tools like solar lighting solutions, solar pumps, solar fans, solar TVs, etc., etc. You offer them access to the banking system. You offer them access to credit. You offer them access to, now with AI, potentially education, where children can get access to a personal tutor in their language, in voice, on their phone. So there is this idea that I have based on my research, which is about giving people at the grassroots opportunities through the market system to participate and acquire and use these kinds of productivity enhancing tools. Once their productivity increases, their incomes increase, and they enter the formal economy, and they can enter even the global economy and participate, increasing their incomes, creating companies that employ other people. So I think there is a way to do it, but it requires participation from people in the grassroots, as you said, people in rural India. And I think we are actually seeing that in front of our eyes increasingly.
Thank you, Professor Jaideep Prabhu, for your insightful address and guidance. I will now request to gather in seminar hall at 5:45 p.m.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody. I really appreciate your giving me this opportunity to speak. Thank you so much for your thoughts and questions. They're wonderful questions. I wish you all the best for the rest of your wonderful conference and seminar. Bye.